Today we're going to be looking at the poem Eat Me by Patience Agbabi. It's one of my favourite poems actually. It's quite an interesting topic. It's, not one that many people want to talk about. It's quite taboo. But, that makes it more interesting than potentially some of the more Victorian poetry that you may be studying in the other component. So firstly, I would suggest you have a look at the terminology on the slide, so end-stopped lines, extended metaphor, enjambment, caesura, and plosive alliteration. And I would hope, based on the fact that we went through those in lesson one, that you should be able to define each of those. If you can't, I would suggest you go back to lesson one and make sure you've gone through the terminology to guarantee that you know what each of those is and how you could comment on those. And for this lesson, obviously, you will need a copy of Eat Me and potentially the revision guide to support you in your learning. So as I mentioned in lesson one, context is not mentioned or not marked for in the poetry essays that you'll be writing for modern poetry. However, I've always said it is interesting to note it and just have a knowledge of it to help you in your understanding of where the poet is writing from, her intentions, and so on. So in terms of context, Patience Agbabi is a British performance artist and poet who gives particular emphasis to spoken word poetry, hence her use of interesting sound patterns and rhythms within all of her poetry, and you'll note that in this poem, Eat Me. Her poetry is known for addressing contemporary themes and issues of race, gender, and of the experience of being an outsider. And in Eat Me, she explores the ideas of taboo and transgression through the controversial feeder and feedee relationship. So I would suggest potentially not Googling that, or if you're going to do it at your own risk. And essentially, it's the notion that someone takes great pleasure and gratification from essentially feeding up a partner. So, for example, in this poem, it's about a male who, I don't want to say, he doesn't force feed her, but at the same point, it is a very dominant, submissive relationship. And he just kind of keeps giving her food and forcing food, even though she kind of may not want it. She almost feels like she has to have it. And he gets gratification from her putting on weight. Um, he doesn't eat the same level as her. It's not like they're both getting larger. It's that he specifically, in this poem, likes the idea of her getting larger and him controlling her weight. Like he likes that part of it. So here's the poem. I will read it through, and as I read it through, I would like you to consider what your initial impressions of the poem are, what you think the story is, what the speaker's like, and what kind of tone they're using. What's the relationship like between the male and the female here, and what kind of powerful imageries are presented. Okay, so Eat Me. When I hit 30, he brought me a cake, 3 layers of icing, homemade, a candle for each stone in weight. The icing was white, but the letters were pink. They said, "Eat me." And I ate, did what I was told, didn't even taste it. Then he asked me to get up and walk round the bed so he could watch my broad belly wobble, hips judder like a juggernaut. The bigger the better, he'd say. I like big girls, soft girls, girls I can burrow inside with multiple chins, masses of cellulite. I was his jacuzzi, but he was my cook, my only pleasure the rush of fast food, his pleasure to watch me swell like forbidden fruit. His breadfruit, his desert island after shipwreck, or a beached whale on a king-size bed, craving a wave. I was a tidal wave of flesh, too fat to leave, too fat to buy a pint of full fat milk, too fat to use fat as an emotional shield, too fat to be called chubby, cuddly, big built. The day I hit 39, I allowed him to stroke my globe of a cheek. His flesh, my flesh, flowed. He said, "Open wide," poured olive oil down my throat. "Soon you'll be 40, he whispered, and how could I not roll over on top? I rolled and he drowned in my flesh. I drowned his dying sentence out. I left him there for 6 hours that felt like a week, his mouth slightly open, his eyes bulging with greed. There was nothing else left in the house to eat. Okay. So the poem the story of the poem, I suppose, is the it is a dramatic monologue, that's its form, and it details a dominant male force feeding his partner to gain more power over her. At the end of the poem, however, the female uses her strength to roll on top of him, thus suffocating him and ending his dominance. And with this, you can talk about the idea of him frequently taking her voice away because he sort of drowns her out with, all this food. But at the end of the poem, she drowns him out, kind of literally, I suppose, by rolling over him and taking his breath away, I guess, and then him dying. And in terms of themes, we've obviously got the theme of power. The poem's about unequal power, balance within a relationship, and how this shifts by the end of the poem. Gender and the gender dynamics between the two. And then consumption. Clearly, consumption is shown through the feeder and feedee relationship, but there are other areas of consumption that are expressed. The idea of the abuse of the planet, the negative impact of human consumption, and so on. So you might want to consider other themes that are present within the poem. What we'll do is I will go through some of the key ideas of the poem and key things that I would select if I was analysing it. I in no way am suggesting this is it, but these are kind of the ones that are basic level. This will get you kind of the C grade if you can put them in a decent analytical essay. But for those that are aiming for the A and the A star, you'll want to consider alternative ideas, further analysis throughout the poem. So just to make you aware of that. So the poem is called Eat Me. That is clearly a command sentence, an imperative, and the idea is it has a double meaning. Eat me, as in something is demanding to be eaten. So in this case, obviously, it's about the consumption of food. However, you could argue that eat me is also sometimes used in terms of, like, oh, go away, oh, eat me, oh, bite me, that kind of idea. It could be a just get rid. There is here and later in the poem as well, some argue a link to Alice in Wonderland. And if you think about in the book, or if you've only seen the film, where she's in the room and she has the eat me and the drink me option, and when she eats the whatever the thing is, mushroom maybe, whenever she eats that, she gets really, really big. So you could argue it's also an allusion to that as well. It's entirely up to you how you interpret it. So when I hit 30, he brought me a cake. So you've got the idea of the verb hit, and that shows there was potentially a sense of violence established at the beginning of the poem through the harsh consonant sound of that word. And it hints at the idea of the relationship being abusive, which is almost ironic considering the next line is, or the next phrase is, he brought me a cake. That's quite a nice thing to do. And yet, as you read further into the poem, you actually see that that's actually a very negative and abusive thing to do. It suggests that he's commemorating her weight. So that idea of her hitting 30, initially you may think it's, her birthday and she's hit 30 years old. But in actuality, it's likely that he's talking about her weight. And that's kind of referenced again in the third line of the poem, for each stone in weight. So actually, she's hit 30 stone and he's rewarding her with a cake, suggesting his fetishization of her body. 3 layers of icing, homemade, a candle for each stone in weight. Fine. The icing was white, but the letters were pink. They said, eat me, and I ate, did what I was told, didn't even taste it. Okay? So then you've got the idea of the use of imperatives, so the eat me, or shows her lack of power. She's just being ordered to do these things, and she does them. She just is powerless to stop them. But note how it's personifying the cake. It's the cake's letters that say eat me, not him. Again, suggesting a level of helplessness there as well. She can't even fight against the food. And then the I ate, did what I was told, didn't even taste it. It's very matter of fact. It's a very blunt tone, again, suggesting her powerlessness and almost her sense of resignation to her fate. I think this inspires sympathy. The idea that, she just can't do anything, but it could also suggest a level of passivity. where some readers may actually get quite frustrated with her because, surely she can do something. And the idea that she didn't even taste it suggests there's no enjoyment to what's happening to her. Moving on. Then he asked me to get up and walk round the bed so he could watch my broad belly wobble, hips judder like a juggernaut. So you've got the idea of her getting up and walking by the bed so he could watch my broad body wobble. There's this uneven power dynamic between the two. He wants to watch her wobble. Suggests he's again fetishizing her body. I cannot say that word, apologies. Um, so again, he's taking enjoyment from the weight that he's making her gain. And the idea that her hips judder like a juggernaut, that simile there, suggests her size. A juggernaut is something massive and huge, etc. But it also dehumanizes her, um, which is sad. A juggernaut also, as an alternative idea, is a very powerful kind of, I won't say mythical thing, but it's kind of a powerful weapon. And the fact that her hips judder like a juggernaut shows there maybe is unrealised power within her, perhaps foreshadowing her using her force against him at the end of the poem. But again, that's for you to decide. The bigger, the better, he'd say. That bilabial plosive, the b, there, and then it goes on throughout the rest, is deliberate, it's dominant, and that kind of then leads into his voice. This is now his voice in the italics, which is dominant throughout the stanza there. So the bigger the better, he'd say. He's depersonalised, he's unnamed. I like big girls, soft girls, girls I can burrow inside with multiple chins, masses of cellulite. He's listing his objectification of women. And also note the idea of girls, that repetition of that noun, plural girls, suggests he's craving their innocence and vulnerability. He's not saying women, he's saying girls. He likes the idea of their youth. Because again, that means he can dominate them easier, which is sad. I was his jacuzzi is a metaphor. Again, continued dehumanization of her. She is for his pleasure. Simple as that. But he was my cook. So that suggests her reliance on him and his role in her life. He is the cook to her. And without food, you cannot survive. So she is very reliant on him. My only pleasure, the rush of fast food. His pleasure, to watch me swell like forbidden fruit. The simile there refers to his fetishization of her, and they both acknowledge this is taboo. So they both know through that adjective forbidden that this is not a thing that can be discussed openly with everybody. His breadfruit. His desert island after shipwreck, where a beached whale on a king-size bed craving a wave, I was a tidal wave of flesh. There is a semantic field of water here, so you've got and the sea, kind of, I suppose, with the idea of the desert island, the beached whale, the tidal wave, and then wave again. Water has hidden power. You walk into the ocean and the ocean may look calm, but actually you don't know what's underneath, think like the current, and so on. So again, it references this idea that she has a hidden power within her. And it is ironic that he calls her a desert island, or his desert island. Could it be that without her, the island, he can't survive. He needs her as much as she needs him. So is it this quite, maybe it is an equal relationship that they need each other, but again, it's quite toxic, quite abusive. So I would be wary of going down that route too far. You've got the use of anaphora in the too fat to leave, too fat, etc. And it references her realization um, of her truth, I suppose. Too fat to leave, too fat to buy a pint of milk, a pint of full fat milk, too fat to use fat, etc., etc. That repetition of fat, it changes the pace and the rhythm, and it also makes her not passive anymore. If you go back through the rest of the poem, it's quite passive and laid back, and she's, having things done to her. Whereas in this stanza, I would argue that she's sort of hitting the realization um, of what is going on with her, and therefore the pace picks up and she starts to become more active, and that's when she starts to decide, or not fight against him, but a little bit more. Um, well, yeah, she's more against him, I suppose. Um, it also may be, as sad as it may suggest, some level of self-hatred. Too fat to use fat as an emotional shield, too fat to be called chubby, cuddly, big built. These euphemisms that people use instead of just acknowledging that they may be fat. They'll say, oh no, I'm just chubby. Maybe her acknowledging the truth is, again, her realizing and her becoming more active in her own life. The day I hit 39, I allowed him to stroke my globe of a cheek, his flesh, my flesh flowed. He said, open wide, poured olive oil down my throat. The notion that she allows him to stroke demonstrates that she's giving him permission. There's a power shift there, which is unusual. Up until this point of the poem, he's been watching her, but now she's allowing him to touch her. So it subverts that previous power dynamic that they had at the start of the poem. Then he said, open wide, poured olive oil down my throat. This action suggests that he's preparing her in the same way you'd cook food. When you cook in a pan, you may start with the oil. And again, with her, it seems, there is no enjoyment to be gained from olive oil. But to use that, it's like he's preparing her like food, like a piece of meat. Soon you'll be 40, he whispered. This is a very ominous line that does create tension, and there's a sense of his growing anticipation. It's quite a horrible line, really. I think the fact that he whispers it as well suggests that he's got this insatiable desire. He's got this goal, and this is what he's going to do, no matter what she wants. He wants her to be 40 stone, or 40, 40 stone, I suppose. And how could I not roll over on top? I rolled and he drowned in my flesh. I drowned his dying sentence out. The narrator rather, seems to be seeking validation from us, where she says, and how could I not roll over on top? It's almost like it's not a question, it's a statement, but at the same time, she is justifying her actions. Like, well, of course this is what I did. I had to, because, he was going to keep feeding me up. So is she justifying it? Is she asking us for permission? Is she asking for forgiveness? We don't know, but you may want to consider that. And then I drowned his dying sentence out. Again, that metaphor of drowning, if we go back to the stanza where she's the water, semantic field of water, we've now got the idea that he is drowning in her. She is the power. She has become that hidden power that we spoke about earlier. I left him there for 6 hours that felt like a week, his mouth slightly open, his eyes bulging with greed. There was nothing else left in the house to eat. So again, you've got the idea of his body, his eyes bulging with greed. It's quite the metaphor, and it's ironic, because the implication of the whole poem is that she should, in theory, be the greedy one because she's the one who's larger. But actually, it was him. He was the one who was greedy. He was the one who wanted her to be bigger, and so on. So, his body is being objectified as being greedy, and then there was nothing left in the house to eat. It's quite the sardonic final sentence here. It suggests that she is finally free from his power and from her need to consume, because she never really wanted to in the first place, you could argue. It's quite a dark, black humour kind of tone at the end there. In terms of structural features, this poem consists of 10 tercets. Tercets are the 3-line stanzas, remember. It's very rigid, it's very consistent in its structure, representing potentially the strict regime enforced by the feeder and the lack of control the speaker seems to have in her relationship. There is a juxtaposition between the assonants, the vowel sounds of cake, wait, the A sound, and the consonants, the B, K, D, T, throughout the poem could symbolise the conflict between the couple. The soft sounds and the soft verses are her, and then the very harsh sounds are him. If you go back through the poem, you'll notice when he's talking, it's quite harsh, or when it's referencing an action of him, it's quite a harsh, toned uh, bit. The use of the end stop lines throughout the poem reinforces her lack of control or suggesting an opportunity for change. And then the tonal shift comes in, that shouldn't say chapter, that should say stanza 7, emphasizing through the change in rhythm and pace, which foreshadows the change in their relationship. And then the exam board have given us this interpretation, and it's up to you whether you agree or disagree with it. It's your opinion. So Eat Me is an audacious, dramatic monologue which examines an extreme kind of unhealthy relationship. Agbabi uses the relationship between feeder and feedee to explore issues of gender and power. That the concerns of the poem are not confined solely to sexual politics is hinted at through some of the language used to describe the woman's body. Forbidden fruit, breadfruit, desert island, globe, tidal wave. These suggest potentially a post-colonial viewpoint in which the colonial authority, identified with the male protagonist, is ultimately overwhelmed by the power of the former colony. However, this dimension is hinted at subtly. The power of the poem lies in the voice of the narrator and the vividness with which her situation is described. Patterns of alliteration, assonance, and repetition combine to convey a cloying sensuousness, which mirrors the excess described. Read aloud, the reader can't help but be sensitized to the mouth and tongue. The rhyme, half-rhyme scheme of ABA further increases the sense of claustrophobia in the poem. In these ways, the subject's physicality is enacted at the level of language. The ending of the poem is quite shocking and worth thinking about in terms of the poem's attitude towards consumption and where this eventually may lead. In terms of a model paragraph, I've sort of done a very short one. I'm not suggesting for a second that this is perfection, but there are always room for improvement. So what would you do? So I was imagine the question, say, how does Agbabi present the theme of identity in Eat Me? So I wrote, at the start of the poem, Agbabi establishes the lack of power and control the speaker has through the juxtaposition of imperative verbs, they said, eat me, and I ate, suggesting her passivity and helplessness. Furthermore, the staccato sentence, didn't even taste it, indicates her lack of pleasure or enjoyment from this exchange, creating a sense of sympathy from the reader, with the matter-of-fact tone suggesting that she has merely resigned herself to this and is not challenging her current situation. Now, in terms of further support, I've listed 3 websites for you there. You would have to just Google them, essentially. And then in terms of additional tasks to develop your ideas, you may want to look at how is the woman's body described and how does the description of the woman's body change throughout the course of the poem, and how does that relate to the shift in power. So if you go back through that poem and consider that idea, you'll potentially come up with some alternative ideas. Look at the form of the poem, in particular the pattern of sound, what effect did these have and how does that relate to the subject matter. And lastly, how effective is Agbabi's use of imagery, specifically in relation to the way in which size and scale are described? Consider the impact on the reader.